About to see are the results of our efforts over the last 12 months to confirm his findings, and then what my CBS colleague George Kreil and I discovered when we took the investigation the next step. What went wrong in Vietnam is still one of the great questions of our recent American experience. We still don't know all the answers. But tonight we shall offer an explanation for one of the great mysteries of the war. Why for so long our government apparently believed, and wanted all of us to believe, that we were winning the war.
We are strong. No nation has ever been stronger. Our troops have courage. None ever have been braver or better trained. Our spirit is sharp. Our cause is just, and it is backed by strength. Our cause will succeed.
But despite all the assurances, we lost the war in Vietnam. The cost? $150 billion, 12 agonizing years, 57,000 American soldiers dead. And the question that still haunts us, how could we have lost the war when for so long we were told we were slowly but inevitably winning? Vietnam was Lyndon Johnson's war. But from the beginning of the American buildup, the president placed his faith in victory on one man, General William Westmoreland. Westmoreland was there commanding the 25,000 American advisors in 1964, urging the president to commit combat troops in 1965. And by 1966, he was Time Magazine's Man of the Year, America's first real military hero since Eisenhower. Cam Bay, October 1966. A moment of triumph for General Westmoreland and for his commander-in-chief. The previous year, Westmoreland had told the president we would lose if American combat troops weren't committed to the battle. The president responded by sending 300,000 more American soldiers. And now Lyndon Johnson was so encouraged by Westmoreland's reports that he concluded a communist victory in Vietnam was, quote, impossible. Vietnam was a war in which statistics ruled supreme, and the main reason for the growing optimism in the fall of 1966 was the overwhelming logic of General Westmoreland's statistics. There were always accusations that the body count was exaggerated, but there was no denying the fact that once the American army intervened, we started to capture or kill enormous numbers of the enemy. And since Westmoreland put the total number of Viet Cong at 285,000, it seemed inevitable that we would simply grind the enemy down. That became the government's position in the summer and fall of 1966. And it was just at this point that a lone analyst at the CIA found reason to question the very basis of General Westmoreland's assertion that we could defeat the enemy. His name was Sam Adams. As you began to study U.S. military intelligence on the ground in Saigon, on the ground in Vietnam, what did you learn about its quality?
I couldn't really tell, except something was terribly wrong.
What was wrong?
Well, you had all the casualties, maybe 150,000. You had all the deserters that I was finding, 100,000 Viet Cong taking over going over the hill, taking off. And this was all happening, this 250,000 guys leaving or getting killed yearly out of an outfit that was supposed to be 280,000 strong. I had to ask myself, who the hell are we fighting out there?
Adams found the answer to his question when a top-secret packet was delivered to his office at CIA.
And what it was a captured enemy document, a translation of one, which arrived on my desk. And it said the number of enemy guerrillas and militiamen in Binh Dinh province was 50,000. And I looked at the official order of battle, and I looked up Binh Dinh to compare it to the document. And I saw the number carried in the official order of battle, that is our official estimate of enemy strength, was 4,500. 1/12 or 1/11, whatever it is, of the number in the document. And there, I saw it clearly. We had been underestimating the number of enemy, probably not only in Binh Dinh, one of 44 provinces, but perhaps through the whole country.
In time, Adams' discovery would precipitate the longest, bitterest battle in the history of American intelligence. But it would be several months before he could persuade the CIA to confront the military with his evidence of a far larger enemy. In the meantime, the president's optimism was growing.
What we do know is General Westmoreland's strategy is producing results, that our military situation has substantially improved.
But despite Lyndon Johnson's assurances, millions of Americans had become disenchanted with the war. And by the spring of 1967, with 500,000 American troops already committed, it was clear that Congress and the American public would not tolerate any further escalation. The angry street demonstrations were worrisome, but far more menacing to the White House were the growing numbers of hawks as well as doves, who were beginning to question the president's claim that we could win. It was at this moment, in April 1967, that Lyndon Johnson took an unprecedented step. He called his field commander home from the battlefront to reassure the American public that the president's policy was sound, that we were, in fact, winning the war.
I was ordered to come to Washington.
I remember there was a great to-do about you coming back from Vietnam.
I wasn't happy about it, but I was ordered back, and I said, if this is what the president wants me to do, well, I'll do my best.
Was President Johnson a difficult man to feed bad news about the war?
Well, Mike, you know as well as I do that people in senior positions love good news. Politicians or leaders in countries are inclined to shoot the messenger that brings the bad news. Certainly, he wanted bad news, like a hole in the head.
But on this day, Westmoreland had mostly good news to offer his commander-in-chief. The Viet Cong's army, he said, had leveled off at 285,000 men. And best of all, he told the president, the long-awaited crossover point had been reached. We were now killing or capturing Viet Cong at a rate faster than they could be put back in the field. We were winning the war of attrition.
Mr. Speaker, General William C. Westmoreland.
Never before had a field commander addressed the Congress in a time of war. It should have been a moment of uncomplicated triumph. But put yourself in General Westmoreland's shoes in the troubled spring of 1967. He had just used very specific figures to assure the president that the enemy was losing strength, that we were winning the war of attrition. And now the president was forcing Westmoreland to put that message on the record for the American public, to assure them that General Westmoreland believed we were on the road to victory.
Backed at home by resolve, confidence, patience, determination, and continued support, we will prevail in Vietnam over the communist aggressor.
What Westmoreland apparently didn't know when he came here to Washington was that his intelligence chiefs back in Vietnam had just discovered evidence that confirmed the CIA's estimates of a far larger enemy. What had happened was that Westmoreland's army had just completed the largest offensives of the war, Operations Junction City and Cedar Falls. A major Viet Cong stronghold had been overrun, and afterward one of the enemy's central headquarters had been found deep underground. American GIs had crawled down hundreds of feet into an elaborate network of tunnels and underground rooms, and had come up with hundreds of thousands of pages of captured enemy documents detailing the Viet Cong's organizational structure and manpower records. With these documents in hand, General Westmoreland's intelligence chiefs had gone to work to check out the CIA's assertion of a far larger enemy. When we began our interview with General Westmoreland, he attempted to dismiss the CIA's reporting on the enemy as unreliable.
There was a few individuals, as I recall, a young man named Adams, who was an analyst, who had a report.
Sam Adams.
I don't know his name, but anyway, his school of thought was that we were underestimating the strength of the enemy. Now, in the meanwhile, we were on the ground. We dealt with every village, every hamlet, every province as a separate item. We didn't use extrapolation in order to come up with a figure.
And your intelligence chief there on the ground in Vietnam, General Joseph McChristian, was the fellow who had developed a lot of this?
General Joseph McChristian was a superb intelligence officer.
Westmoreland's intelligence chief, General Joseph McChristian, began his career estimating enemy capabilities as General George Patton's intelligence chief during World War II. A West Point graduate, he was the military's chief of intelligence for 2 years, 1966 and 67 in Vietnam.
So when it came to reporting on the enemy, you didn't especially count on the CIA's work on this score. You stood by the work of General McChristian and his staff.
Well, sure. The CIA was very remote. We were on the scene.
What Westmoreland failed to tell us in our interview was that here at the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV as it was called, his intelligence chiefs had come to agree with the CIA's growing conviction that we were fighting a far larger enemy. They had been studying the captured enemy documents, and when Westmoreland returned to MACV headquarters, General McChristian and the military's leading expert on the Viet Cong, Colonel Gaines Hawkins, presented him with the bad news. Hawkins began the briefing.
The figures that I briefed on that particular occasion were the new strength figures on the political order of battle, as we call it. This is the Viet Cong's political bureaucracy and the guerrilla strength.
Colonel Hawkins told us MACV intelligence had determined that there were a lot more VC out there than had previously been recognized. In fact, he says that these major intelligence reports pointed to a dramatic increase in enemy strength estimates. In fact, something on the order of 200,000 more VC. Do you remember that?
I remember such a report, yes.
I don't want to read anybody's mind, George, but there was a great deal of concern about the impact that this new figure would have, and General Westmoreland appeared to be very much surprised of the magnitude of the figure.
According to Colonel Hawkins, he said that the general seemed to be taken by surprise. He remembers your first words after listening to that briefing were, "What am I going to tell the press? What am I going to tell the Congress? What am I going to tell the President?" True?
I do recall a session with Hawkins, yes, but I was very, very suspicious of this particular estimate. And the reason was that you come to a shade of gray. You get down at the hamlet level, and you've got teenagers, and you've got old men who can be armed and can be useful to the enemy, and who are technically Viet Cong.
Right.
But they don't have any military capability of consequence.
There was no mistaking the message.
Which was?
That there was a great concern about the impact of these figures, that they're being higher.
They didn't want higher numbers.
That was the message.
This is the way General McChristian remembers Westmoreland's reaction to the briefing.
And when General Westmoreland saw the large increase in figures that we had developed, he was quite disturbed by it. And by the time I left his office, I had the definite impression that he felt that if he sent those figures back to Washington at that time, it would create a political bombshell.
I was not about to send to Washington something that was specious, and in my opinion, it was specious.
But General Joseph McChristian, a man whom you call a superb intelligence chief, he's the fellow who comes in and says, "General, we've been wrong. There are twice as many people out there.
Well, I have great admiration for General McChristian, and he did a good job. But in this case, I disagreed with him, and other members of my staff disagreed with him.
Consider Westmoreland's dilemma. If he accepted his intelligence chief's findings, he would have to take the bad news to the president. If he didn't, well, there was only General McChristian to deal with.
Evidently, people didn't like my reporting because I was constantly showing that the enemy's strength was increasing. I was constantly reporting that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong had the capability and the will to continue a protracted war of attrition at the same level of operations that were currently going on for an indefinite period. And I personally wrote that paragraph in every estimate I sent in and insisted that that be known. Maybe there was objections to that.
Sir, that was running strongly against the grain of popular wisdom at that time.
But not against fact.
I did not accept his recommendation. I did not accept it. And I didn't accept it because of political reasons. That was I may have mentioned this, I guess I did. But that was not the fundamental thing. I just didn't accept it.
What's the political reason? Why would it have been a political bombshell? That's really...
Because the people in Washington were not sophisticated enough to understand and evaluate this thing, and neither was the media.
We underscore what General Westmoreland just said about his decision. He chose not to inform the Congress, the President, not even the Joint Chiefs of Staff, of the evidence collected by his intelligence chief, evidence which indicated a far larger enemy.
In a time of war, when you're talking about enemy strength estimates, what are you thinking, General McChristian, when you confront your responsibility?
Well, I feel this way, that decision-making in time of war not only involves the lives of the people on the battlefield, but involves the future liberty of your people at home, and that there's no place, and that's why the West Point motto has honor in it. There's no place for an officer in any executive department of government, much less the military, who cannot conduct his public duty honorably.
Shortly after Westmoreland suppressed his intelligence chief's report, General Joseph McChristian was transferred out of Vietnam. It was at this point, we believe, that MACV began to suppress and then to alter critical intelligence reports on the strength of the enemy.
Okay, we got one on the run. Don't shoot him. I want to force him down. We've got him running again, people. You see that? There's somebody right in that straw. Right, there's somebody right at the end of that straw pile there.
By the summer of 1967, the American Army had grown to a force of almost 500,000 men. We were now everywhere in Vietnam. And the elaborate intelligence network that General McChristian had created was continuing to discover more and more of the Viet Cong's elusive guerrilla army. Only now the soldiers in the field started to find that when they identified enemy soldiers, even when they discovered entire new Viet Cong units, MACV's new intelligence chiefs were not including them all in their estimates of enemy strength. One of the first to be confronted by this strange phenomenon was MACV's newly appointed guerrilla analyst, Richard MacArthur.
I found that someone was changing the numbers that were reported by the sector advisors in the field.
Changing the numbers?
Mm-hmm.
You mean the actual totals were not getting translated into official figures?
Exactly.
In one province, an angry colonel confronted MacArthur, accusing him of changing the numbers.
He had listed 500 guerrillas.
Right.
Right? So I said, fine, all right, 500 guerrillas in the province. Then he said to me, now I want you to look at the OB summary. Now, I didn't have a copy with me, but he happened to have one there. The OB summary showed 250 guerrillas.
The total in the official estimates, the order of battle, OB.
Exactly.
has half of the number.
Right, and he was quite disturbed, to say the least. What could I say to him?
While this new problem was developing in Vietnam, back in Washington, the CIA was at last forcing a full-scale confrontation with General Westmoreland over his estimates of the size of the Viet Cong's army.
What was at stake in this battle between the CIA and the military over enemy strength?
It was a fundamental question of the soundness of our policy, of our whole approach to the war in Vietnam. The question of whether we ultimately, finally, we're going to come to grips with the nature of the war and the scale of the enemy forces we're up against, or whether we're going to continue this process of self-delusion.
George Allen was the CIA's #2 man on Vietnam. Back in 1967, he was the government's leading expert on the enemy.
The scale of our effort was conditioned to our understanding of the enemy forces that we're up against. And as long as we underestimated the size of the enemy forces, it seemed to me and to others that we were going not to be taking the kinds of efforts, the scale of effort required to attain the goal that had been set, which was to prevent the communists from overrunning South Vietnam, to maintain a non-communist government in the South.
And if you were to have confronted reality as you saw it, a far larger enemy as the CIA saw it, an enemy almost twice as large as what we had previously thought.
This would mean that forces on our side, resources on our side, would have to be committed on a far larger scale than people were thinking of in order to attain our objective.
And that's what the CIA's battle with the military was to be all about. How many Viet Cong were we fighting? Could we win with the numbers of American troops committed to the war? The confrontation took place here at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, at something called the National Intelligence Estimate Board. And the man designated to present the CIA's case was George Allen's protege, Sam Adams, the man who had first discovered evidence of a larger enemy army.
Let me understand something.
Okay.
This is a meeting of what is called the National Intelligence Estimate Board.
That's right.
Which in effect, it's been called the Supreme Court of the CIA.
Yeah, that's right.
Who takes part in those meetings?
Well, they take place on the CIA 7th floor, and you have members of the Board of National Estimate, the judges, so to speak. And then you have representatives from all the other agencies, including CIA, and then the Pentagon has people going over the State Department and so forth.
All intelligence types?
All intelligence types. It takes place in a room. There's about 40 people in the room.
And ironically, the man sent to represent General Westmoreland's position was none other than Colonel Gaines Hawkins, MACV's leading expert on the Viet Cong, the same Colonel Hawkins who had tried to convince General Westmoreland to accept the evidence of a far larger enemy.
I was quite relieved when I saw him. You know, here's old Gaines Hawkins, whom I'd known for quite a while by this time. And I figured, you know, we're on board now. Everything's going to be all right. He agrees that the numbers are way higher. And then he gives a presentation the first day. And he had changed all the order of battle around. And the bottom line of it, the number that he was coming up with, was 294,000, almost exactly what had been all along. And I did a double take. I said, what's going on here?
I mean, you've had conversations with him.
I'd had conversations with him.
In which he suggested that it may be 100 or 200,000 more than that.
Yeah, right. In which he'd, he basically agreed with me. And then here he is. He comes out with this number, which is exactly, almost exactly the same it had been before.
Did you generally agree with Sam Adams that the official estimates needed to be dramatically increased?
Absolutely, and I told him so.
At the meeting?
I believe so. That I told him at the meeting. And
at the National Intelligence Estimates meeting when you were carrying MACV's position?
Yes. As I recall, I did tell him that I thought our figures were lower than they actually should be.
Well, how could you have done that?
Schizoid, dealing from both sides of the deck, or Sam and I had a an analyst-to-analyst relationship.
It was one of the most unusual performances I've ever seen in my whole life anywhere. Colonel Hawkins was on this one side of the table arguing for the lower numbers, and I was on the other side arguing for higher.
Right.
And the problem was, old Colonel Hawkins, whom I knew so well and whom I admired, looked sick. Looked like he didn't believe what he was saying.
There was never any reluctance on my part to tell Sam or anybody else who had a need to know that these figures were crap. They were history. They weren't worth anything.
Some things happened that gradually made me understand what was going on. One of the things he was doing is every time he would argue for lower numbers, he would say, the command position is such and such. And then, and this happened on a number of occasions, he would come around and say to me, the command position is such and such, but my personal opinion, Sam, is there a lot more out there.
So Gaines Hawkins, the man, was going to tell the truth to...
The analyst.
The analyst, Gaines Hawkins, was going to tell Sam Adams the truth, but...
Sam Adams, the analyst.
But Colonel Gaines Hawkins, MACV's representative, was going to battle CIA's Sam Adams.
That is correct.
Did you never say to him, Colonel Gaines, look, if I am right and you acknowledge that I'm right, and American troops are going to have to face a much larger enemy than they're being told, a lot of them are going to get slaughtered.
Right.
Did you never say that to him?
I knew he knew it. I knew also that he was must have been in a terrible position. He would never have done that himself. I knew the guy too well. Obviously, he was under orders somehow.
CBS Reports has learned that Colonel Hawkins was, in fact, carrying out orders that originated from General Westmoreland. Westmoreland says he doesn't recall these orders. But the head of MACV's delegation told us that General Westmoreland had, in fact, personally instructed him not to allow the total to go over 300,000.
Wasn't there a ceiling put on the estimates by General Westmoreland? Weren't your colleagues instructed, ordered, not to let those estimates exceed a certain amount?
We can't live with a figure higher than so-and-so.
300,000
is the message we got.
Colonel George Hampshire was one of several members of the military delegation troubled by having to carry out General Westmoreland's command position.
I was uneasy because of the bargaining characteristics. This is not the way you ought to do it. You don't start at an end figure and work back. But we did.
You should know that these men that I've mentioned felt very uncomfortable carrying out your order. They felt that this arbitrary ceiling, you're not to go above 300,000.
Well, if they felt that way about it, why didn't they forthrightly tell me that? They didn't.
Pretty good question.
They didn't.
And they take the responsibility for it. And they say, we were wrong.
I am a staff officer, and I defended the command position. I did it in full knowledge, and if it were immoral or illegal or reprehensible, the fault is here. It doesn't go anywhere else. I defended the command position on the figures.
Colonel Hawkins assumes full responsibility for his actions. But we went to General McChristian, his old intelligence chief, to ask what we should think of General Westmoreland's instructions.
To put a ceiling on enemy strength estimates, to tell an intelligence operation that it is not permitted to report enemy strength estimates over a certain number. What does that constitute, sir?
From my point of view, that is a falsification of the facts.
Are there statutes in the Uniform Code of Military Justice that would speak to that situation?
Not that I'm aware of, but there's something on a ring that I wear from West Point that the motto is duty, honor, country. It's dishonorable.
In the summer of 1967, the war in Vietnam was escalating, and so too was the intelligence war between the CIA and the military over the number of Viet Cong we had to contend with. In that invisible war, hidden from the American public, General Westmoreland's officers were in trouble. They had been instructed to argue for estimates far lower than they believed to be true, and they were still finding it next to impossible to keep the enemy strength totals under 300,000. It was at this point that General Westmoreland pursued a new tactic. He proposed that an entire category of the Viet Cong Army, the self-defense militia, a force of more than 70,000, simply be dropped from the order of battle. Those Viet Cong had been included in the military's estimates of enemy strength ever since the beginning of the war. Westmoreland had included them in his briefing to the president. But now he was suddenly saying they no longer posed a military threat and henceforth should be treated as if they didn't exist. Reporter George Kreil asked the CIA's George Allen what part these Viet Cong soldiers played in the war.
What was your position on the military potency of the self-defense militia, their part in this war?
Well, they were an integral part of the military potential of the communist forces in South Vietnam. In fact, the guerrilla militia forces are a fundamental part of communist forces in any people's war. They were the ones that ambushed our forces when they would enter VC-controlled areas. They were the ones who booby-trapped. They were the ones who helped the populace in general build the punji stakes and other devices that inflicted losses on our forces encroaching in their area. The self-defense militia were responsible for a large proportion of our casualties. They did have military potential. They did engage in activities which did inflict losses on U.S. forces.
The fact is that these village defenders had a minimum to do with the outcome of the war. The punji stakes, sure, there were people hurt by punji stakes.
And mines.
But they had no offensive capability.
When they defect or come in, you count them as a casualty. If they defect to the government or surrender, you count them and you put them in the POW cages. If you knock one off, if you kill them, they join the body count. And I said, look, if you're going to count these people when they're dead, why can't you count them when they're still alive?
By excluding the paramilitary forces, the militia and so forth, from the order of battle, we were skewing our concept of the kind of war we were involved. We were skewing our strategy. We were not acknowledging that indeed there was an important indigenous South Vietnamese component, that indeed it was a civil war.
This is a non-issue, Mike.
Well, here's the issue.
I made the decision. It was my responsibility. I don't regret making it. I stand by it, and the facts prove that I was right. Now let's stop it.
All right, sir. Question. And this goes to something that you talked to me earlier. We're moving ahead now. One wonders. You told me earlier that commanders-in-chief don't like to hear bad news. Presidents don't like to hear bad news.
Now, who does?
Nobody does.
Who does?
Right.
I mean, you're talking about human nature.
Of course. Isn't it a possibility that the real reason for suddenly deciding in the summer of 1967 to remove an entire category of the enemy from the order of battle, a category that had been in that order of battle since 1961, was based on political considerations?
No, decidedly not.
Didn't you make this clear in your August 20th cable?
Yeah, no.
I have a copy of your August 20th
sure,
cable.
okay.
Spelling out the command position on the self-defense controversy. Yeah. As you put it in the cable, you say the principal reason why the self-defense militia must go, quote, was press reaction.
That cable, dated August 20th, 1967, spelled out General Westmoreland's predicament. We have been projecting an image of success over the recent months. The self-defense militia must be removed, the cable explained, or the newsmen will immediately seize on the point that the enemy force has increased. The cable went on to say that no explanation could then prevent the press from drawing an erroneous and gloomy conclusion.
Well, sure, they would have drawn an erroneous conclusion because it was a non-issue. It was a false issue. It would have totally clouded the situation, which would have been detrimental.